I want to welcome everyone to the next section. Is there a crisis in peer review? And we're gathering up our panelists. I know Holden Thorp has joined us, and I know Ruth O'Hara is logging on. So let me just start and introduce myself, and then we'll do a little bit of housekeeping. So I'm Paul Fisher. I'm a member of COPE Council, professor of pediatrics and neurology at Stanford, and also editor-in-chief for the Journal of Pediatrics. I am super delighted that Holden Thorp, who is been editor-in-chief of the Science family of journals since 2019, has joined us. He's had a great career already at Science, but before that, he was provost at WashU at Washington University from 2013 to 2019. And concurrently with all his work at Science, he's also professor of chemistry and medicine at George Washington University here in the States. I think joining momentarily will be Ruth O'Hara. Ruth is a senior associate dean for research here at Stanford at the School of Medicine. She's also professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. Her research itself focuses on longitudinal investigations of the relationship between neurocognition and neuropsychiatric symptoms in normal and pathologic aging. She also deals with a host of research ethical issues here at the university. So let me just give a very quick introduction of the topic, and then we'll start the conversation. So basically, peer review is a system, if people look into the history of it, peer review has not been eternal. It's been a process popularized really post-World War II when there was an expansion of academic journals. And where we are in the current crisis is this problem in basically keeping up with the sheer volume of research that we publish today. You know, what was 100,000 papers in the 1950s is now bordering on 5 million papers. So we've had a lot of issues, not only in the volume, but then also in the ethics that have happened. Let me just start also with a question to Holden. We're going to start with the positive side of the research of the crisis in peer review, but can you just start out by telling us a little bit from your viewpoint as an editor and academician about the importance of peer review? Why is it integral to publishing and research integrity?
Yeah, well, I think that we have countless examples of where papers have been improved and changed by peer review. It's easy to see that now because you can look at the preprint and you can look at what ends up in the journal. Uh, there are plenty of times when there isn't much change, but for us, science itself only publishes 750 papers a year. And we have professional editors who handle the process. And so there usually are significant changes that occur and new experiments that are done. And that is all crucial because I think one of the things that people misunderstand about peer review is what we ask the reviewers to do. We don't ask them to rerun analyses and look for scientific misconduct or things that a lot of people ask after the fact. We really ask them two things. One is, does this paper belong in our journal, whether it's Science or one of our sister journals? And do the experiments that have been described support the conclusions of the paper? Because ultimately in research integrity, we're always looking at, do the conclusions of the paper still stand? And so we need to know if they stand before we do the publication. And so I think a lot of people who are sort of down on peer review because we miss some things in misconduct are misunderstanding what we ask the reviewers to do. The people on this call who handle research integrity investigations know how much work that is. And we wouldn't get any reviewers if we told people that you had to do that on every single paper. And so I think that the system as we have it is still incredibly important. And I think for us, we have countless examples of how it has stopped us from publishing papers where the experiments didn't support the conclusions, and where it has helped us improve the ones that we have published.
So I would just add to that, contrary to urban legend, reviewer number two is not the enemy, and and there are a lot of pluses. Ruth, do you want to add to that about the importance, particularly from your perspective on the university side?
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, my apologies for having such technological difficulties this morning. Um, I think, for me, independence is the critical term when it comes to peer review, that you're having an entity that is qualified, expert, but entirely independent of the academic environment from which the publication is coming, to review that paper. And I think it is a process that has, like all processes, difficulties, but the vast amount of evidence suggests that peer review is really a strong and robust process that can, in fact, give us that independence in reviewing science that's kind of critical to research integrity. So that's really the positive component of peer review. And I think it has sustained the test of time for that reason.
And I want to emphasize that positivity because we're going to explore in this session some of the limitations currently we're facing in peer review, but I don't think that's meant as a condemnation of peer review. Toward that end, though, Holden, particularly in science, I've been following some of the things you and others have written. You've been following some of the issues in peer review. What do you see right now as the most pressing ethical issues that are being encountered in the field in peer review?
Yeah, I think that the biggest issues are really not ones around peer review so much as they are around things that you were discussing in the previous session, which is a general sense that correcting the scientific record is a bad thing. And it shouldn't be. We should celebrate when people have the courage and forthrightness to celebrate to correct the scientific record. And we're having a hard time getting there because when I write to people and say, we need to do something with your paper, they say, this is going to taint me and this is, you're coming after me. And, well, you published the paper in Science. A lot of people looked at it. So guess what? A lot of people found stuff. Now, how that relates to peer review is that the peer reviewers are also human beings. The editors are human, the authors are human, the peer reviewers are human, the people who put the papers up on the website and get them formatted and all that, they're human. And we don't seem to be able to acknowledge that as human as this whole process is, that which we probably celebrate a lot of times, it means that humans also make mistakes, and the only solution to that, to preserving that, is to be able to correct ourselves when we do make a mistake. And I think the thing that that comes to that around peer review is that when we do a retraction or correction, and we have a hard time getting this across to people, we're taking at least 50% of the blame for the fact that the paper got through with whatever error it is that we're talking about. And that's ultimately on us. It's not on the reviewers. We selected the reviewers and we decided whether to take their reviews at face value or not. And it's no different than the error that the authors made in their paper. And so I think what's hard right now is we want to take responsibility for the errors that we make. And unfortunately, sometimes the authors don't want to come along with us, and that creates a contentious situation.
Ruth, anything to add in terms of ethical issues that you're seeing from your side in terms of peer review?
And in terms of peer review, I think one of the domain areas, of course, is making sure that conflicts have been addressed. I mean, conflicts are a critical source of bias. So making sure that the reviewers really are actually not conflicted. And that can be very hard to assess because it's not always clear. You can have, beyond any kind of bias that we deal with typically in academic settings of conflicts that really revolve around, engagement with external entities. That's where our focus goes. But there are conflicts that occur when individuals have a very specific perspective or specific scientific theory approach that can sometimes conflict with, in fact, the paper that's incoming to that reviewer. And I do think that making more room for authors of articles to actually be able to, as many journals do, suggest reviewers, but also making the editorial process robust enough that actually it catches those who might have a particular bias. We're all biased in multiple ways every day in all that we do. And so it can be easy for bias to actually encroach on the review process in both a way that favors a paper or a way that actually dismisses an idea that is not mainstream for the reviewer. That's where the editorial review process has to come in place. There are many significant aspects of, say, statistical robustness. The journals have actually implemented over the years the review of those components. Often those components are reviewed independently by individuals who actually work for the journal. And those can be actually really supportive of making sure that the work that's submitted is accurate. But I think maintaining an environment in which bias is minimized is really important for a good, strong review process from an ethical perspective.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you raised that, Ruth. And I think, the topics of bias, conflict of interest, and then even suggesting reviewers. And I'm going to go back to Holden on this too. That, one of the things, Holden, that I see at this point in my career, gray-haired, is introducing junior faculty and trainees to the process of peer review, and particularly in certain fields where people are time cramped, we have to sort of justify the time. We have literally faculty come and say, well, what am I getting out of this? Am I getting academic credit? Am I getting paid? Why should I do this? So one of the questions to you is, how you're fortunate. You're at Science, which is an elite journal, but there are now thousands and thousands of journals. So how do we keep up with this demand for peer reviewers? How do we educate and bring more into the system?
Yeah, well, I think so. We continue to experiment with new ways to recognize our reviewers. And we're always looking at ways that we can do that without violating confidentiality. We're a journal that I know a lot of people think we should change this, but we're a journal that still believes that keeping the peer reviewers confidential is a smart thing to do to protect them mainly. And so I think that figuring out how to recognize that is important, and getting the institutions to help us convince their colleagues that that's an important part of participating in the scientific ecosystem. But the main problem here is not so much that you're talking about, is just the onslaught of bureaucratic tasks that every researcher has. I mean, I recently moved as you said in the introduction, my faculty appointment from WashU to GW. And just to teach my class, the number of forms that I have to fill out and rubrics that I have to complete, and it's just completely gotten out of control. And it's also uncomfortable for me because it makes me realize when I was a provost, I probably created some of these bureaucratic hurdles. And the publication process has gotten the same way, because now we have all these checklists to make sure that all the data are posted. And so the bureaucratic aspects of being a researcher at a university have just exploded. And all of us, we're trying to automate. We're working on some new ways to automate things like figuring out whether all the data that need to be posted have been posted. And we're automating our plagiarism and image checks. And we're continuing to try to make all of this easier, but the institutions and the funding agencies are just piling on so much bureaucratic workload that that's squeezing out peer review. That's my main analysis of this problem.
So I'm going to segue to you, Ruth. You and I are both part of the institution. What should we be doing on an institution level? Is there a way to either give academic recognition in the promotion process for faculty? Should faculty be paid? There's a class action suit against some of the publishers right now that peer reviewers should be paid. If we do that, what kinds of ethical conundrums do we get into? So I'll give it to you.
Well, I think you're hitting a very important point, Paul. There is no question that institutions can play a critical role. And I think part of the role that they can play is actually perhaps making sure that the bar for publication when individuals come up for promotion is in fact reasonable. To Holden's point, we're all restricted and limited on time. And I think we haven't really accommodated to, in fact, expectations for the number of publications, where they're published, the impact factor of their journal, in response to, in fact, the limited time individuals have, given, in fact, this bureaucratic load that Holden has spoken to. So I think one place that, as an institution, we can help in this regard is with our expectations, particularly of junior faculty with respect to promotion. Now, that's independent of encouraging them and others to actually engage in the peer review process. I think having a combination of junior and senior faculty reviewing, which is often standard, can be extraordinarily helpful, a way we can cast the review process as actually a training and mentoring exercise. And I think that's perhaps an area where the publications themselves and publishing houses could take even a bigger role, which is in the use of this process for actually education around rigor and reproducibility. There are domain areas, for example, in the review of genetic papers, where standards were laid down when we started to do these whole genome and genotyping, because of the requirements there and the difficulty of actually navigating that amount of data. Really very stringent sort of guidelines got laid down for publication, and many journals. And I think moving towards an educational role intertwined with peer review could be a way of really starting to make this a particularly valuable exercise, particularly for junior faculty. That's certainly how we suggest junior faculty get engaged in peer review, is by talking about how valuable it is an experience for them. It's certainly acknowledged in most promotional processes, but not perhaps to the extent that offsets maybe the time investment, and recognizing it can be an extraordinarily helpful and beneficial process to learn about, in fact, the submission of papers and what's entailed. And that's really how we encourage our junior faculty to get on board in what's a particularly important community-based activity in academia.
No, I couldn't agree more, Ruth. It's taking the high road, and I think your point is something that COPE members can certainly take to heart. This is going to be an issue of publishers, journals, and universities. COPE is trying to actually work increasingly with universities as part of this, even this Publication Integrity Week. And that's really the way to go. I just wanted one more question on this topic because your journal highlighted it, Holden, in the Science in the News section a couple months ago. There was a really nice piece that was talking about pay-to-play peer reviews, and where there were certain journals, I won't go into which publisher, basically almost it was becoming a sort of a peer review rather than a paper mill. It was a peer review mill. So let's talk about, if we went the other way, paying reviewers and things like that. Are faked and poor reviews a hazard? What do you think?
Yeah, I think they would be. And as you point out, science occupies a pretty privileged position. Most people still do want to review for us, although we have more trouble than a lot of people might think getting enough reviewers for a paper. But I think that I think the danger of paying for peer review is then people would review papers frequently and quickly just to get the money. And that's certainly not something that we want to do. And so I think other journals will experiment with this. They'll try to figure out ways to make this work in a wholesome way. And if they do, we'll pay attention to that and adapt down the line. But science, sometimes this frustrates people, but we're usually the last ones to get on board with this kind of thing. And the reason is that when we decide to do something, it sends a pretty strong signal to the ecosystem, and a lot of people might do it. So we tend to be pretty cautious with this kind of stuff.
I'm going to jump ahead.
But I do think other journals will continue to experiment with this, and we'll see how that all plays out. It has a lot of risk associated with it, as you pointed out.
Yeah, I'm worried about the risk, and journals and publishers are experimenting. And to that point, Ruth, you mentioned earlier about suggesting reviewers in papers, and I've been going back and forth with my publisher, Elsevier. So Elsevier is working toward a policy of not allowing suggested reviewers as of this week. And I'm not sure, we're sort of debating within our own journal about how we want to do that, particularly for some niche papers. But your thoughts about is not allowing suggested reviewers for fears of fake reviews and sort of gerrymandering. Is that a way to go? Yes or no?
It's a great question. It comes back to the point I made earlier about our bias. I think editorial oversight is kind of critical for the selection of reviewers. And it's highly unlikely that anyone would suggest a reviewer that they might think is unfriendly to the domain area. And, we don't talk, I think, a lot about scientific bias. We talk more about conflicts that are based on being paid to review, but I think the scientific bias is also an important one. And when you get to suggest reviewers, you're actually stacking that deck a little bit. However, I mean, my observation is that editorial decisions don't always involve inviting those reviewers. And it's not clear to me that having maybe a balance of individuals who are entirely independent and actually those who the author might perceive as friendly is necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, the extent to which we're independent is important. It's also important for the author to have a say. And I think sometimes authors can be aware of at least individuals being very interested in the perspective without necessarily having a relationship with them. So I think, as long as there's good editorial oversight, having authors be able to suggest reviewers, as long as it's not overused, is still something that sometimes can provide the author with a certain amount of assurance that there is a balanced portfolio of reviewers actually going to review their work.
Great. I think we're all agreeing that peer review is here to stay. It's not going extinct. But I want to just sort of, in the last questions here before we get to the audience, where do we think peer review is going in the next 10 years? And I'll start with you, Holden. Where is peer review going to evolve, particularly in terms of research integrity? Is AI going to be part of peer review? Where are we going?
Yeah, so I think, well, let's set AI aside for a second. That's a whole different thing. I think that journals will continue to experiment with things. They'll continue to work with reviews that are published, reviews that are signed, various kinds of schemes for blinding the papers. We run little internal experiments on these kinds of things, and we watch very carefully when other people do these experiments. We're not going to make a big change based on intuition. And so we need to see either in our own data or in data from other journals that gets published that these changes are actually going to help. Because I think a lot of people get dogmatic about, oh, if you just publish the reviews, or if you just sign the reviews, or if you just did double blind, all these problems will go away. And to the extent that those things have been tested, most of the time, there's usually not a lot of signal there. And so we're not gonna, we'll watch what everybody does. I happen to, a lot of people find this shocking, but I happen to be a fan of what eLife is trying. Not so much because I think it's the right thing for us, but I think we learn a lot from watching that play out. And I guess I can understand why Clarivate took their impact factor away, but I sure hope they keep doing that, because that's something that all of us can learn from. If you're an author in eLife, you may have a different opinion about that. But from our perspective, these kinds of experiments are good. Now, as far as AI, I think the engines that we have now certainly don't do a good job of peer review. They even don't even do a good job of summarizing the paper. Our PR team has experimented with their human written summaries versus AI generated, and they have a lot of interesting data on the challenges that happen. Now, the LLMs will get better. There's no question they will. But I think it's still AI only helps you if you're giving it good human prompts. And I've fed plenty of papers that have been retracted or corrected or been contentious into the various new engines, and said, what do you think of this paper? And it gives me a very uncritical analysis. Now, if I prompt it again and say, but didn't this person in this other paper say this about it, then eventually it'll build itself to the right answer. But how much time that's saving me compared to doing it myself, I guess your mileage may vary on that. So we have expressly forbidden the use of AI to do reviews, and I'm certain continue to hold to that. The last thing we need is less human participation in all of this.
I couldn't agree more. AI is, I do think it's a great tool. I mean, I can say from an editor's point of view, I've used it once or twice in very niche areas to try to identify a couple reviewers. ChatGPT is very good at looking for things, but again, it's a tool in as much as a calculator or a computer's a tool. Ruth, I'll let you have the final say on the future of peer review, of where we're going in the next 10 years before we open it up to questions.
Well, I think from an academic institution perspective, peer review is the lifeblood. It is integrally related to, of course, the academic promotion and the academic judgments that are made of our faculty. So it's critical. I think the next 10 years, I would hope, would see more of an embracing of sort of an interface between academia and peer review, where there is feedback and guidance. Holden and I have already talked about, really the importance of journals to embrace null findings when they're done well, of course, because we feel that some of the pressure on junior faculty or individuals in general to potentially step in terms of their interpretation of the results comes from a pressure to have positive findings, to make room in journals for really good explication of negative findings is critical for all our fields. And really important then to change the academic culture to adapt to those kinds of changes, recognizing the importance of the reviewer role and how successful that has been as a reviewer for some of our faculty coming up for promotion, and the importance of that as good citizenship. And as a tool for guiding greater rigor and reproducibility, it's a wonderful way to encourage individuals now, because it's so required by most journals, to actually have their data in an open forum where others can actually utilize that data, see if they actually can find more information, replicate. So from a reproducibility perspective, it's a phenomenal tool that I believe will only grow in its importance over the next decade.
So before we phase to the questions here, I'm just going to share one brief story and try to circle back to the positivity, sort of a reviewer two story. I was at a meeting about 10 years ago next to a colleague, and I asked him how his day was going, and he shared with me that he was having a rough time because of a review he'd just gotten. It was 2 pages with a lot of detail and a lot of suggestions and things like that. And I remember very calmly looking straight forward, nodding his eyes, and then just grabbing his hand and saying to him, "That was my review." And so there is a strength. I think peer reviewers play a great role in making a paper stronger, and it made that paper stronger in a very high profile journal. So there's a lot of strength. I'm looking at the questions here. I'm going to start one down here. They're being upvoted, some of them, but this is a great question. Comment here. I'd argue that reviewer training and mentorship should be part of the PhD programs at the institutional level. Thoughts? How about you, Holden?
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think that we are doing what we can to try to. We don't think graduate students should be independent reviewers of papers, but we certainly understand that mentors may want to work with them on that, and we trust that the confidentiality will be protected. But we are actively promoting the idea of postdocs reviewing papers so that when they become independent faculty members, they'll be well versed in reviews. So yeah, I think this needs to be something that people trainees learn throughout the process. It's an important part of the process, just as much as doing the research and writing the paper.
Ruth, your thoughts?
I totally agree. And in fact, many of our programs, both pre-doctoral and postdoctoral, integrate the review of papers and the breaking down of published papers in a way that is very amenable to then actually involving that in training exercises that actually facilitate our sort of next generation really learning how to do this and do it well in a way that's very helpful for our authors who are submitting those papers. I think it needs to be an integral part of our educational process.
So then another question here I'm going to add to a little bit regarding the topic of independence in peer review. Do we have a clear definition of what independence in peer review is? That's, I guess, also free of bias. Is it just financial, non-financial? There are a lot of complexities. There are a lot of direct ties. We all know each other in some small fields. Some fields are quite niche, and it's really hard. I think we've all had the occasion where we're struggling to find that reviewer who we think is going to be fair and independent, and particularly on these multi-author papers where you've got 30 institutions. So what is independence in peer review? Ruth, Holden?
Well, we have an extensive list of questions that we ask reviewers when they're helping us understand whether they have a conflict or not. No list is going to be perfect and comprehensive. For us, with our 5 of our 6 journals have academic editors. Those individuals We don't allow them to handle their mentors' papers for the first several years that they're working with us. But they are very independent. And so for the professional editor journals, that's an additional check because they're not out publishing in the areas, and they don't have their own stakes in the various hypotheses and things that are being discussed. We also have an academic editor run journal, Science Advances, and that's the majority of journals out there. So in those cases, the conflicts thing becomes even more complicated because now you have the editor's potential conflicts. And I think it's like all the things we've been talking about. You're not going to catch every conflicted reviewer. And so again, if we can get to a world where correcting these things after the fact is less punitive and viewed more as a wholesome activity, then when we get problems with conflicts that get raised after papers get published, we'll have a much easier time dealing with them.
Ruth, what do you share with colleagues about reviewing, not reviewing? When should they back away as there's a conflict, or they shouldn't take on the review?
Well, I think obviously there's the easy ones. It's your same institution. You don't do that. It's uh, individuals that you work closely with, that you've published with. But the problem is, in an era where we're really evolving to, embrace team science, more interdisciplinary work, which is so valuable for us all. Actually being able to make sure that you have identified individuals who haven't those kinds of conflicts is becoming increasingly challenging. And so a lot of journals now will have a time limit, like not, within the last few years, maybe it's at 3 years, but it's really often up to the reviewer to self-declare those potential conflicts, and some are more obvious than others. I think this is a place where the editor in particular can be very helpful, because sometimes, even if you have no relationship with a reviewer as an author, there can be bias that creeps in that's evident, perhaps even in the reviews. And I think this is a place where editors can really play an important role by, keeping an eye out for potentially sources of other types of bias, be it scientific, be it a theoretical perspective. And I think we haven't talked a lot today about the critical role of editors, but I think they can also be very helpful for ensuring that they're actually getting reviews that appear to be pretty balanced and fair.
Well, we'll put one editor on the spot with that question. We often say in our own journal, reviewers advise, editors decide. So I know you've made some really tough decisions, Holden, I'm sure over the years at Science. What do you do when you have either reviews where at some point you have to make a decision and you're not? I'm sure there's been an occasion when you're just not happy with all the reviews and you have to come to some decision on a paper. What do you do?
Well, we have to do that almost every time. It's rare that we get three exciting publish right away reviews. If we do, we'd worry that we're not getting a critical enough review of the paper. So what I tell our folks, first of all, the people who handle papers for us, who are experts in their area, if the paper is assigned to them, they absolutely have the final word on whether the paper is published or not. And they have my full support in their decision. Sometimes people try to get me to change their decisions, and I say, well, is rhenium dioxophotochemistry in your paper? Because otherwise, I'm not really qualified to say anything about it. And that's not really in fashion right now. So I always back up the decisions of my editors, because if that goes away, then our whole system would be really messed up. But my view is that other than the graduate student or postdoc who's the first author, the person in the whole chain who likely knows the most about the paper is the editor when we're dealing with professional editors. So I always want them to ultimately trust their own instincts. Now, the way we do it at Science is, again, this is a very privileged thing, is that at least two of our other editors collaborate on the decision of the paper. So that's a lot of horsepower that goes into these decisions. But absolutely, every paper I've had that's gone sideways, if I go in and look into our system and look at the chats, the most likely person to say, I don't know, I got a funny feeling about this, is the editor, much more so than the reviewers. And so we cling to that as much as we can.
I'm going to turn over. There's so much in the Q&A about difficulty in finding reviewers. I'll share one experience and then get your reactions and comments. So I think in the last 2 years as editor, I've turned away 2 papers for just inability to find any reviewers. And I can say in both cases, after about 15, 20 invitations, no one. And then we certainly, as an internal check, had an editorial board member or two beyond the associate editors look at the paper and just said we needed to part ways. But there are times when something is so niche, it's just, I'm not expert in chemistry. I'm not expert in a lot of things. And so I guess, what do you do when you're simply struggling to find reviewers, Holden?
We do sometimes turn them away because we can't get reviewers. We try to do that as quickly as possible as a service to the authors. But yeah, it does, even for us, certainly at Science Advances, which is a large journal that publishes a lot of papers, that does happen from time to time.
And then Ruth, any other thoughts? Certainly part of an incredible university system, things we can do to grow the culture of peer review in the younger folks.
I think, we've alluded to the issue of time here, but I don't think we've fully grasped the nettle. When I started reviewing, I'll give away my age, you typically had 6 weeks to review. And interestingly enough, I always found that was quite a manageable time period. We've seen that shrink because there's more pressure to get papers out. People are on deadlines for the importance of that information being disseminated. And I think that is an issue. It's a really critical issue. It means I think more reviewers turn down the invites because of the time constraints. And I've done this just as an editor myself, a managing editor on several papers, where I will actually go in and alter that time frame and find that I can get more reviewers by being able to give more time. I think we might have to evaluate the pressures that we're all facing, the bureaucratic pressures, the time pressures, and really see if maybe a return to giving reviewers more time might increase our ability to get more thoughtful and engaged reviews. I am someone who very much appreciates the anonymity for reviewers, but I do think having reviewed and being reviewed by journals where there is this open exchange with the reviewer, going back and forth where you know who they are, has actually been some of the most positive, even if laborious experiences, tremendous learning exercise, and perhaps imbuing some of that, particularly at the earlier stages of career where people could really benefit for that kind of feedback. It could be very helpful to identifying reviewers because it also helps them. It becomes an exchange of information rather than just one entity reviewing another. But this is probably the greatest challenge of our day, is actually getting sufficient numbers of reviewers. I think junior investigators are very eager to review. They need a very good a senior reviewer along with them in order for those decisions to be made, but maybe formalizing that partnership of junior and more senior reviewers could also help us draw more reviewers into the field, and then also making sure that there is academic acknowledgement for actually engaging in the review process, particularly particularly up through the promotional process. So there is also credit there. I think there's a lot to be done in that regard.
Yeah, there's a lot in the Q&A about just everyone feeling burnt out. I mean, there's even a question here. I'll throw it out to my COPE colleagues too for the future. Can COPE have a training program for young researchers to learn peer review? That's something we can take up at a future COPE meeting. I just want to turn to the editor side for all three of us because I think it's really important to point out too that peer reviewers they can't do everything and they are a scarce commodity. And I think early on, I told our editorial board we were going to have to take a little bit of a higher desk or edit reject rate on papers. And I think that's one of the things I sort of use a litmus test if it's a paper that I'm going to, if I see Holden in a meeting and I have to walk the opposite hallway because don't want to look him in the eyes, I can't believe I sent him that paper. I probably should have never sent him that paper to begin with. But your thoughts about editors and editorial boards being a little bit more stringent about what gets sent out for peer review. Holden?
Yeah, and speaking of time pressure, I got to go in a minute because to another meeting on this very same topic. But yeah, I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask. Science desk rejects about 85% of what we get. Science advances desk rejects about 75% of what they get. So yeah, we we only engage with papers that we think have at least a 50% chance of getting in the journal. We try to review about twice as many papers as we accept.
I mean, I can agree. The Journal of Pediatrics, my journal, we reject about 75 to 80% as well.
Yeah.
Ruth?
Yes, that's obviously one of the critical ways one can actually improve and streamline the process. But with that said, particularly people publishing for the first time, submitting their papers and manuscripts for the first time, having an opportunity to get that feedback in the early stages and learn from it can be invaluable. And there might be many such papers that could be easy rejects, but where the benefit to the field and to the individual author of having their paper go through the review process cannot be understated. So I think we have to figure out some solutions there as well, because a hard reject rate, I think, is maybe going to leave some really important science on the table.
Yeah, unfortunately, Ruth's correct about that. It pains me. But we just don't have the bandwidth to do that for papers that we don't think are going to make it. And we do need, as an industry, to come up with a way to help young people who are just starting out get more feedback on their papers.
So I want to respect time for you, Holden, because I know you do have another meeting, and I thank you for squeezing us in. I'm going to give you one lightning question, which is probably a good question for you then to exit stage left. Lightning question is, do we have too many journals?
Yeah, we have too many journals. We have too many papers. We have the institutions are putting too much pressure on people to publish too much stuff. If we would slow down and publish the good stuff, a lot of these problems would be a lot easier to manage. And the problem is nobody knows how to unilaterally disarm. And so the institutions are going to keep building buildings and keep racking up overhead that they can use for stuff. And they're going to keep competing with each other, and the PIs are going to keep competing with each other. And that's just driving all of this stuff in the wrong direction. So if anybody has a grand solution to that problem, please let me know. I'll let you write it up on the editorial page of Science. All right, see y'all later. Bye.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to give Ruth one last question here from the group, and then we're going to end this session. Ruth, last question here. This is one that just came in. Someone who's working to build their reviewer database, and they've been really working, it sounds, assiduously to have senior reviewers invite junior colleagues to work within our reviewer report. I know some journals even certainly have a box where it says, have you had a junior colleague participate in this? So it seems that publishers and editors could place more responsibility to try to get senior authors to help pass the baton. Your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think that's absolutely a tremendous approach. Some journals already, as you say, offer it. I think sometimes senior faculty were doing that more informally, having a junior faculty member or a junior investigator actually review a paper, which they would then review also, but maybe give the experience to the junior person and actually get some additional thoughts and ideas. And I have to say, I think formalizing those approaches, making them more common, will be a critical way to help many problems in the field, not least of which is having the opportunity to actually learn from a senior investigator if you're actually new to this, starting off as a junior investigator.
Well said. And I'm just going to put a bow on the end. I want to thank you, Ruth, for doing this. And I just want to close by saying um, peer review is not going away, but we do need to reinvent it, rethink it. Reviewers are a scarce commodity, and we certainly need to on-ramp the junior guard.